So get this, what if a 70-year corporate war wasn't actually a bad thing, but the very secret sauce for global domination? And what if the whole thing kicked off, not in some stuffy boardroom, but because of a love story and a really terrifying diagnosis? Okay, we're gonna dive into the absolutely incredible origin story of Novo Nordisk.
All right, to really get why this story is so huge, we've got to go back in time. We're talking the early 1920s. Now imagine you're a parent and your child gets diagnosed with what we now call type 1 diabetes. Back then, the doctor would tell you they had, on average, less than 2 years left. That's it. It was an absolute death sentence.
Yeah, for literally thousands of years, people just called it the sugar sickness. Nobody really understood what it was, but they knew one thing for sure: it was always fatal. You'd watch a person just waste away. They'd have this unquenchable thirst, lose a terrifying amount of weight, and then inevitably slip into a coma and never wake up.
And get this, the only so-called treatment they had was just horrifying. Doctors would prescribe a brutal starvation diet. It didn't cure a thing, of course. All it did was stretch out the inevitable. You were basically trading a quick death for a slow, agonizing one. I mean, that's how desperate things were in the world before insulin.
Okay, so against this incredibly bleak backdrop, a very personal crisis brewing over in Denmark was about to light a fire that would spark a global medical revolution. And it all came down to one pretty remarkable couple.
So let's meet them. On one side, you've got August Krogh. This guy was a total titan in European science, a professor of physiology who had just won the Nobel Prize. And on the other side, his wife, Marie Krogh. Now, she was an absolute powerhouse in her own right, a brilliant physician and researcher, and one of the very first women in Denmark to even get a medical degree. But then, in 1921, she got that diagnosis: the sugar sickness, diabetes. And that right there brings up a huge question, right? August Krogh's Nobel was for his work on how muscles use oxygen, totally unrelated to diabetes. So why on earth would a guy at the absolute peak of his career suddenly pivot and chase a cure for this sugar sickness? Well, the answer was personal. It was sitting right across the dinner table from him every single night.
And from here, things start moving incredibly fast. I mean, think about it. In 1920, August is in Stockholm accepting a Nobel Prize. The very next year, 1921, his wife is handed a death sentence. And by 1922, they're in the US for a lecture tour. But Marie, she's got one thing on her mind: these rumors she's hearing about a potential miracle happening up in Toronto.
So picture this. They're at a dinner party in America, and they start talking to this top diabetes doctor, a guy named Elliot Jocelyn. And he tells them, look, the rumors are true. The team in Canada, they're not just messing around in a lab. They are actually saving people's lives right now. It was Marie, who, remember, is both a doctor and a patient, who just insisted. She said, we're not continuing this tour. We are going to Toronto now. So, long story short, they go to Toronto, and they manage to secure the license to produce insulin for all of Scandinavia. It's this incredible, heroic mission. So you'd think, okay, everyone in Denmark is gonna rally together, unified for this great cause, right? Yeah, not so much. Instead, what happened next kicked off one of the most intense and, believe it or not, productive rivalries in the history of medicine.
Just a couple of years later, by 1924, the whole thing had split right down the middle. On one side, you had Nordisk. This was the original group. Very academic, very cautious, do everything by the book. But one of their key guys felt totally stifled by that, so he left and started his own company, Novo. And Novo was the complete opposite. They were all about moving fast, being commercially aggressive, and taking big risks. And these two polar opposite cultures, they were about to go to war for the next 70 years.
And what came next? Well, it wasn't just quiet scientific discovery. Nope, it was an all-out arms race. This crazy intense local competition became the engine for decades of relentless, non-stop innovation.
You see, especially after World War II, Nordisk and Novo were constantly just trying to one-up each other. It was this fierce battle that led to huge breakthroughs like NPH and Lenten insulins, which were total game changers for patients. They were in this constant fight over who could make a purer, better product. And every single time one of them made a move, the other had to counter, pushing the science forward step by step.
So here's the really wild part, the main takeaway. This bitter rivalry, it wasn't a bug, it was a feature. It was their greatest strength. This constant, nagging pressure to be better, faster, purer. That was the secret engine that let them survive huge global events like World War II. And more than that, it's what set them up to one day take over the entire global market.
But, even the most legendary rivalries can't last forever.
By the time we get to the 1980s, the world is a very different place, and these two bitter enemies found themselves facing a stark choice. Either join forces or get wiped off the map completely.
So, think about it. After 70 years of genuinely trying to destroy each other, what on earth could be so powerful that it would make these two lifelong adversaries even consider getting into a room together? Well, the answer was coming, and it was about to change the future of diabetes care forever.
Turns out there wasn't just one threat, there were two huge ones. First, there was this brand new technology called recombinant DNA. It basically threatened to make their entire way of producing insulin totally obsolete overnight. And second, you had these massive global players, like Eli Lilly in the States, who had way more money and resources. All of a sudden, their little Danish backyard squabbles started to look, well, pretty small.
And so, in 1989, the absolutely unthinkable happened. The 70-year war was over. The two companies, Nordisk and Novo, laid down their arms and officially merged.
I think they finally realized that all that expertise they built up trying to beat each other was now their single biggest weapon. By coming together, they weren't just ending a family feud, they were forging a unified front, creating the global powerhouse we know today as Novo Nordisk, ready to take on the entire world.
So our story actually kicks off not in Denmark, but in Canada. We're in the early 1920s, right at the heart of one of the biggest medical discoveries in history, which, believe it or not, had created its own massive crisis. What you had here was a total paradox. On one hand, it's a miracle. The discovery of insulin meant that getting a type 1 diabetes diagnosis was no longer an automatic death sentence. But on the other hand, the team in Toronto that discovered it, they were completely and totally overwhelmed. They couldn't make enough of it, and the stuff they could make wasn't pure enough. It caused all these painful side effects. A miracle cure you can't actually deliver is hardly a miracle at all.
Okay, so into this absolute chaos walks our main character, a Danish scientist named August Krogh. And his timing? Well, it couldn't have been more perfect. He wasn't just anybody either. This guy was a Nobel laureate. His reputation in the scientific world was rock solid, so when he spoke, people listened.
And this right here is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. Krogh saw the struggle the Toronto team was facing, and he saw a way to help. And it all came down to this truly unique business agreement.
Krogh's proposal was bold and super direct. He saw this huge humanitarian crisis unfolding and basically told the Toronto committee, look, let me take your methods back to Denmark. I'll set up production for all of Scandinavia. Let me help you ease this burden.
Now, the Canadian team, they were swamped. They knew Krogh was the real deal and could deliver, so they agreed. But there was a catch. One single crucial rule that would define everything that happened next.
That crucial point, the one stipulation that changed everything, was this: the whole thing had to be non-profit. This wasn't about making a fortune, it was about saving lives. It was a principle that was baked in from the very first handshake.
So, what did non-profit actually mean in this case? It was a brilliantly simple and powerful idea. Any money left over couldn't be paid out to shareholders. Nope. It had to do one of two things: go right back into the lab to fund more scientific research, or be used to make the drug cheaper for people who couldn't afford it. It's this beautiful, self-sustaining cycle of science and accessibility.
So, armed with the license and this incredible mission, Krogh headed back to Copenhagen in December 1922. And man, the race was on to turn this promise into a reality. Krogh knew he couldn't do it alone, so he put together an absolute dream team. You had him, the visionary with the scientific knowledge. Then he recruited Dr. H.C. Hagedorn, a brilliant physician, to handle all the clinical stuff. And for the capital and the manufacturing muscle, they turned to a pharmacist and industrialist named August Kongstedt.
So Kongstedt is in. He agrees to put up the cash for the risky startup phase and provide lab space. In return, he had just one request. The first Danish insulin had to be called Insulin Leo after the lion symbol of his own company. It's kind of funny, right? A little touch of commercial branding on what was a fundamentally non-commercial project.
And the speed they worked at, it was just unbelievable. So Krogh gets back in December. By winter, the same winter, they're already running experiments. By spring, they've successfully extracted usable insulin. And then get this, on March 13th, 1923, less than 4 months after Krogh got back, the first patients in Denmark are being treated. Just wow, absolutely remarkable.
So the treatment was a huge success. Now the team had a new challenge. They had to formalize this lightning-in-a-bottle operation into a real company, one that could carry that original promise long into the future.
First step. In May 1923, they officially established Nordisk Insulin Laboratorium. But the real genius move came 3 years later, in 1926. They created the Nordisk Insulin Foundation, and its job was to hold all the company's assets. And look, this wasn't some feel-good mission statement on a plaque. This was a legally binding corporate structure designed specifically to protect the mission.
And that foundation structure, it was just a brilliant move. It legally locked in the principles from that original Toronto Agreement, ensuring that forever, in perpetuity, the company's profits would be funneled right back into the science that started the whole thing.
You can really see how this whole origin story just forged the company's identity, its DNA. From day one, Nordisk wasn't just another drug manufacturer. It was academic in its approach. It was high-minded in its purpose. And it was deeply, fundamentally woven into the fabric of the scientific world.
We're going to dig into an absolutely wild origin story. It's about how one single, explosive argument back in the 1920s didn't just end a few careers, it launched a massive pharmaceutical rivalry that changed medical history. I mean, seriously, how does that even happen? It sounds totally made up, doesn't it? But this is the real story of Nordisk and what would become Novo Nordisk. It all started with a massive clash of personalities that just spiraled out of control. So let's get into it. And what's really wild is just how fast this all went down. The whole drama plays out in just a couple of years. It kicks off with a really important hire in 1923. Everything boils over with a firing just 1 year later, and by 1925, bam, a legendary rivalry is born. Okay, so to really understand this conflict, you have to know who we're dealing with. On one side, you've got this established medical giant, Nordisk. And on the other, you have these two incredibly smart brothers they hired to turn all of their big ideas into an actual product. And these two groups could not have been more different. I mean, they were like total opposites. Nordisk was the scientific elite, founded by guys who'd won Nobel Prizes. They were the thinkers. The Peterson brothers, Harold and Thorvald, they were the doers, the hands-on engineers hired to actually make the insulin. And let me tell you, these brothers were the real deal. Harold was a mechanical genius who literally invented a machine that dramatically increased how much insulin they could get. His brother Thorvald was the skilled pharmacist handling all the complex chemistry. But here's the key thing. Thorvald was ambitious. He knew his worth, and he saw himself as an expert, not just some guy on the assembly line. So you can probably see where this is going. The problem wasn't the science or the work itself. Nope. It was a fundamental clash of personality, a battle for professional respect, and maybe even a bit about social class. You had two completely different worldviews colliding. Dr. Hagedorn at Nordisk, they called him an aristocrat of science. He was stern, demanding, and he looked at the Petersons as his employees, plain and simple. But Thorvald Peterson saw it differently. He saw himself as a co-creator, an expert in his own right. He did not appreciate being managed so rigidly, and you can just feel that tension building up. Yeah, that kind of tension can only simmer for so long, and in April of 1924, the whole thing was about to explode. And this is the moment everything changes. The showdown, it's gone down in history for a reason, because this wasn't just a firing. It was basically a declaration of war. The fallout was immediate and absolute. We don't know the exact words they threw at each other, but we know the result. Hagedorn fires Thorvald, and in this incredible show of brotherly loyalty, Harold quits on the spot. Just like that, their dream team was shattered. But this is where the story becomes the stuff of legend. The co-founder of Nordisk, August Krogh, asks Harold what he's planning to do now. And Harold's answer was so simple and so incredibly gutsy. We want to make insulin. And Krogh, this Nobel Prize winner, he just dismisses them. He basically laughs and says, well, you'll never manage that. Talk about a massive underestimation of their skill and their sheer will to get revenge. And Harold's comeback? 3 simple words that became their mission. A promise that was also a warning. We will show you. That, right there, is the moment this rivalry was truly born. So think about it. The Petersons are on their own. No Nobel Prizes, no fancy labs. But they had the one thing that mattered. They knew how to do the work. And they immediately set out to prove everybody wrong. starting in, of all places, a basement. And the name they picked for their new company? Novo Therapeutics Laboratorium. Novo is Latin for new, and you better believe that was intentional. It was a direct shot at the old way of doing things over at Nordisk. And they moved incredibly fast. They set up a lab in Harold's basement, figured out how to make a stable liquid insulin, and by February 1925, less than a year later, they were already selling insulin Novo. They even came up with a brilliant innovation, a more user-friendly syringe. They were already thinking about the actual patient. So now we get to the final fork in the road, the moment that cemented this whole thing. With their product ready to go, the brothers made one last attempt to maybe, just maybe, avoid an all-out war. Before going all in, they reportedly went back to Nordisk and put an offer on the table. They suggested a collaboration, an olive branch, really, hoping to work together with their former employer. The answer? The hard no. Krogh and Hagedorn rejected the offer, and when they did that, they slammed the door shut on any chance of working together. And that one little word, no, basically set the DNA for these two companies from then on. Nordisk stayed focused on the doctors, leaning on its medical authority. But Novo, born out of that basement lab, became all about the user, driven by pure technical innovation. One was founded on prestige. The other was born from a grudge. And that was it. That rejection was the point of no return. From that day forward, the Danish insulin industry was going to be designed by these two giants, locked in a never-ending competition. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the origins of these two rivals. Then we'll see how their completely different ways of thinking led to something called the hospital war. After that, we'll get into the huge scientific breakthrough that changed everything. And finally, the wild strategy one company used just to stay in the fight. Okay, so our story starts in Denmark. For over a decade, you've got these two companies, Novo and Nordisk, basically growing up side by side. But they were on a total collision course, and it was setting the stage for a conflict that would become legendary. And you've got to understand, this wasn't just your average business competition. No, this was a clash of cultures from the very beginning. On one side, you had Nordisk. Think of them as the scientific establishment, very academic, all about the research. And on the other side, you had Novo, the scrappy commercial upstart, super aggressive and laser-focused on conquering global markets. This clash of philosophies wasn't just some idea they talked about in the boardroom. It shaped literally every single decision they made, from what happened in the lab to how they sold their products. This chart really lays it all out, doesn't it? Nordisk, led by a scientist, was all in on pure research. They wanted to be the top choice for the medical elite. But Novo, led by engineers, they were all about efficiency and building a massive sales network across Europe. I mean, they were playing two completely different games from day one. And this quote right here, it just gets to the absolute heart of Nordisk's belief system. For them, treatment wasn't just about selling a drug. It was a science. Everything, and I mean everything, was about perfect patient care through strict control and absolute precision. So it wasn't long before this philosophical divide blew up and spilled out of the lab and into the real world. The rivalry got so intense that it started what people actually called the hospital war, a direct fight for the trust, the loyalty, and, yeah, the health of patients. It all kicked off in 1932 when Nordisk founded the now world-famous Steno Memorial Hospital. But Novo wasn't about to be outdone. Just 6 years later, in 1938, they fired back, opening their own facility, the Fidor Diabetes Sanatorium. And listen, these weren't just buildings. They were physical monuments to their competing visions of healthcare. Nordisk's Steno Hospital was basically the crown jewel of their whole operation. It became this global center of excellence, where all their product development was driven by what they were learning from patients, cementing their reputation as the scientific leaders. Now, Novo didn't have those deep academic connections, so they had to play a different game. Their Havrode Sanatorium was a brilliant countermove. It was designed to offer a more patient-friendly, holistic approach, focusing on the entire patient experience, not just the hard science. The contrast is just so stark, right? Steno was all about scientific rigor. Fidor was about a warm, holistic approach. Each hospital was dead set on proving that its method was the one that led to better lives for people with diabetes. And here is the absolute key takeaway. This crazy, fierce competition had this incredibly positive side effect that nobody saw coming. In their race to one-up each other, they accidentally lifted the standard of diabetes care in Denmark to the best in the entire world.
But the war wasn't just being fought in the clinics. The real high-stakes battle was happening in the laboratory. It was a race to find the next great leap forward in insulin therapy.
Both companies were chasing the exact same holy grail, a long-acting insulin. You see, the goal was to create a formula that would release slowly, freeing patients from having to take multiple, painful injections every single day. It would be an absolute game changer.
Then, in 1936, Nordisk had a massive eureka moment. Their scientists figured out that if you added protein, a protein from, get this, the sperm of river trout, to insulin, it created a compound that dissolved slowly after it was injected. This was the secret sauce, and it led to them perfecting what became known as NPH insulin in 1946.
This wasn't just a win for science, it was a commercial superweapon. Nordisk patented the whole protamine method, which gave them this huge technological advantage. And for their rival, Novo, this was an existential threat. I mean, how could they possibly compete when Nordisk now owned the patent to the best insulin on the planet? So, Novo was backed into a corner, basically facing total annihilation. They had to get creative. And what they did next was one of the most brilliant and surprising pivots in pharma history. A move that had absolutely nothing to do with insulin. I mean, really think about that for a second. Put yourself in their shoes. Your main rival has seemingly won the race. They've got the patent, they've got all the momentum. The game looks over. What do? The answer, amazingly, came from sheep intestines. Yeah, you heard me right. It was totally out of left field, and a true masterclass in turning a weakness into a world-changing strength. So here's how they pulled it off. Just 2 years after Nordisk's huge discovery, Novo pivoted. They realized the equipment they had for processing animal glands could be used for something else entirely. So they started making sterile catgut, a material made from sheep intestines that's used for surgical stitches. This incredibly clever move created a brand new source of revenue that kept the company alive while Nordisk was dominating the insulin market.
Okay, let's dive into a story that sounds like something straight out of a thriller. We're talking about World War II, under the shadow of Nazi occupation in Denmark. And right in the middle of it all, you have these two rival companies facing an absolutely impossible choice. See, they made insulin, a medicine that could save millions, including, well, their enemies. What they did next is a masterclass in survival, sabotage, and how a massive crisis can forge a corporate empire. It's a tale of impossible choices where the fate of millions literally hung in the balance. So this puts you right in their shoes. The central question for these companies was just brutal. Do you collaborate to keep a life-saving medicine flowing to everyone who needs it, or do you resist and risk losing everything? Seriously, what would you do? For them, this wasn't just some thought experiment. It was their daily reality for 5 long, harrowing years. To really get a handle on their dilemma, we've got to go back to the moment everything changed. The Nazi occupation of Denmark didn't just bring soldiers and tanks. It brought an existential crisis that threatened the supply of one of the 20th century's true miracle drugs. So, April 9th, 1940. That's the day Germany invaded. And for the next 5 years, Denmark's entire economy was basically swallowed up by the German war machine. All the normal supply lines for trade and raw materials, gone, just completely cut off. And that created a desperate situation for anyone trying to make complex medicines. You know, the single most important ingredient for making insulin is pancreas glands from livestock. But with the war totally disrupting agriculture, animal feed became scarce, slaughter rates dropped, and the supply of these glands just dried up. Now, this wasn't just a business problem. For diabetics all across Europe, this was a potential death sentence. And this raw material crisis created a profound ethical minefield. On one hand, you have this humanitarian duty to make medicine, but on the other, you've got an occupying force demanding you supply them and their territories, which would, directly help their war effort. So what was the solution? A very, very dangerous double game. They actually called it the double game. It's this strategy of having 2 faces. Outwardly, you comply. You keep the factories running, you make the medicine, you supply the markets they tell you to. But behind the scenes, you are actively working to undermine the very people you seem to be cooperating with. And the sheer audacity of this operation was staggering. Publicly, you've got trucks shipping life-saving insulin all across what was called Fortress Europe. But secretly, those same factories and those same trucks were being used to hide weapons for one of Denmark's most famous resistance groups, Holger Danske.
They were even diverting company money to finance sabotage operations. And let's be absolutely clear about the stakes here. This wasn't some kind of corporate risk, like a bad stock price. This was a mortal risk. If the Gestapo ever discovered this double game, the company's leadership would have been executed on the spot, and the factories, the only source of this life-saving insulin, would have been destroyed. The risk was absolutely total. So inside this shared crisis, the two main rivals, companies called Nordisk and Novo, were forced to choose their own paths. And the decisions they made over these next 5 years wouldn't just determine whether they survived, they would reshape the entire industry for the next century. On one side, you have Nordisk. They had deep ties to allied partners in the UK and the US. So for them, full cooperation with the Nazis was just unthinkable. They chose the path of principle, turning inward and focusing only on supplying Denmark. They basically put their business into hibernation. But on the other side was Novo. As a big continental exporter, they were mandated by the occupiers to supply all of Europe. They chose the path of pragmatism and expanded, dramatically ramping up production to meet the insane demand. So one stagnated on principle, the other grew through pragmatism. And this is where the story takes this incredible turn. For Novo, that immense pressure of the wartime mandate, combined with the severe shortage of materials, it forced them into this period of desperate innovation that would, well, change their destiny forever. They just couldn't get enough pancreas glands to survive on insulin sales alone. So they started looking at their own waste. And they had this huge breakthrough. They realized the residue, the pancreas gunk left over after they extracted the insulin, was packed with other really valuable enzymes. Their ingenuity was just remarkable. Here's how it worked. Step 1, extract the precious insulin. Step 2, take the leftover waste and isolate an enzyme called trypsin. Now, what's trypsin for? It's used in tanneries to soften leather, a material in extremely high demand for military boots. So they sold the enzyme, made a huge profit, and used that money to keep their life-saving insulin production afloat. Out of medical waste, they built a whole new business. Amazing. This spirit of just finding value anywhere led to their next great leap. See, the war had also spurred huge interest in another new miracle drug, penicillin. But trying to produce it in occupied Europe was nearly impossible. So Novo's approach was what you might call scavenger hunt science. They launched a crash program, basically telling their employees to bring in any mold they could find. People were literally scraping fungus off of old ski boots and jam jars, all in this desperate hope of finding a usable strain of penicillium. And incredibly, it worked. By 1947, they were one of the very first companies in Europe making stable penicillin, diversifying their business yet again. So as the war finally came to an end in 1945, the entire landscape for these two companies had been completely redrawn. The principled hibernation of one and the pragmatic, scrappy innovation of the other had created a brand new world order in their rivalry. Now just look at this chart. In 1940, at the start of the occupation, Nordisk is clearly the established, larger company, the dominant player. But then look at 1945. Novo hasn't just caught up, it has exploded past its rival in production capacity and resources. The balance of power was completely flipped, all in just 5 years. And the consequences of this were enormous. Novo emerged from the war as the new dominant player. The capital they built up during the occupation allowed them to pour money into post-war research and development, which let them set the terms of the competition for decades to come. It was all born from the choices they made under occupation. It's this amazing story about how decades of just fierce, head-to-head competition fueled innovation, pushed science to its absolute limits, and, in the end, changed the lives of millions of people with diabetes. And it all kicks off with one single make-or-break question. Think about that. What do you do? This question is the spark that ignites the entire story we're about to tell. It's a crisis that pushes one company right to the edge, setting the stage for a battle that lasts for decades, where the only real weapon that matters is scientific brilliance. Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is 1946, right after World War II. This period became known as the Chemistry Wars, where the battles weren't fought on a field, but in the laboratory. And in 46, the very first shot was fired. Nordisk makes this absolutely brilliant move. They launched something called NPH insulin. It was a huge improvement for patients because it lasted longer. And it was so successful that it didn't just sell well, no, it became the worldwide standard. They basically cornered the entire market. And for Novo, this was a complete catastrophe. Nordisk's patents meant they were totally shut out. They couldn't make the new standard of care. I mean, their very survival was on the line. So what do you do? What do you do when your rival literally owns the key to the entire market? Well, you get creative. You innovate. Backed into a corner, Novo's researchers started this desperate search for a long-lasting insulin that, didn't step on Nordisk's patents. They needed a breakthrough, and they found one in the most elegant way you can imagine. So this researcher, Kare Hollis Miller, and his team at Novo had a realization. They figured out that Nordisk's patent was all about using a protein to slow the insulin down. So they thought, okay, what if we find a way to do it without any protein? And they discovered that if you mix insulin with zinc in just the right way, it forms these tiny, stable crystals that dissolve slowly all on their own. No protein needed. It was genius. And here's the kicker. Novo's new creation, which they called the Lenti series, wasn't just a workaround. It was actually better. See, the protein in Nordisk's insulin could cause allergic reactions in some people, but Lente was protein-free, which made it safer. Novo hadn't just dodged a patent, they'd come back with a superior product. And this was a huge, huge win for them. When Lenti launched in the early 1950s, it basically saved Novo from going under and proved that they could go toe-to-toe with Nordisk on pure scientific innovation. The playing field was level again. But the war wasn't just being fought in the lab. As this rivalry got more and more intense, a kind of invisible strategic advantage started to show itself, one that was all about how each company was structured from the ground up. Okay, so both companies were controlled by foundations, right? But their missions were worlds apart. The Nordisk Foundation was mainly philanthropic. Its goal was to support science in general. But the Novo Foundation, set up in 1951, had a totally different mission: to ensure the survival and aggressive growth of its company. It was a structure literally built for corporate warfare. And this setup gave Novo some incredible advantages. It meant they couldn't be bought out by a hostile competitor, it kept the company from being broken up, and it gave them this rock-solid foundation for making big, bold, long-term moves that a normal company might be too scared to make. So, by the time we get to the 1960s, the rivalry enters a whole new phase. The fight wasn't just about how long insulin lasted anymore. Now, the battleground shifted to a critical new frontier: purity. You have to remember, back then, all insulin came from the pancreases of cows and pigs. And those extracts, they weren't clean. They came with this whole cocktail of other proteins and hormones that, they caused some really serious problems for patients. One of the biggest side effects was something called lipodystrophy. Basically, the body's immune system would react to all those impurities in the insulin, and it would cause this visible, often distressing loss of fat right where people were injecting themselves. It was a constant physical reminder that their medicine wasn't perfect. Novo saw this as a huge opportunity. They invested a ton of money into advanced purification technology. And in 1973, they delivered another game-changing innovation: monocomponent, or MC, insulin. This stuff was so unbelievably pure that the body barely even recognized it was a foreign substance. It was a masterpiece, both clinically and for marketing. That MC brand became the gold standard for quality and safety, and it sent Nordisk scrambling to catch up. Again. But hold on, all this cutting-edge research and development costs a fortune. So you have to wonder, how did Novo keep affording to out-innovate its rival? Well, the answer, believe it or not, lies in a completely different aisle of the supermarket. It turns out, during this whole period, Novo used its expertise in fermentation to build a second, absolutely massive business, making industrial enzymes for detergents. They actually became the world's largest producer, creating this huge river of cash, totally separate from their pharma business. This was Novo's secret weapon. While Nordisk was focused almost entirely on medicine, Novo had this giant financial war chest, funded by laundry detergent, that let it take bigger risks and pour more money into research in its ongoing fight against Nordisk. So, after all these decades of patent wars, scientific showdowns, and clever business moves, what was the final result of this incredibly intense rivalry? Well, it was this constant cycle of move and countermove, right? Nordisk comes out and dominates with NPH. Novo fires right back with Lente. Then the whole battle shifts to purity, and Novo takes the lead with MC insulin. Every single move forced the other side to respond, to get better, to innovate faster. And that, right there, is the true legacy of this war. The relentless, non-stop competition between Nordisk and Novo pushed the science of animal insulin to its absolute peak performance. Every victory, every counterattack, it all resulted in better, safer, more effective medicine for millions of patients all over the world. All right, let's get right into it. Today we're talking about one of the most audacious financial plays in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. It's really a story about how a pretty small company from Denmark decided, you know what? We're going to take on the biggest financial market in the entire world. And that's the question, right? It just sets the whole thing up perfectly. We are talking about a total David versus Goliath situation here. But instead of a slingshot, our hero's weapon of choice was a stock listing. So let's break down exactly how they pulled this off. So to really get a handle on this incredible gamble, we've got to rewind the clock back to the 1970s. You have to picture the global drug industry as this massive tank full of sharks. And these Danish companies, well, for all their potential, they were basically minnows. And here was the heart of their problem. You see, developing new medicines, building these cutting-edge factories, it cost an absolute fortune. But the Danish stock market, it was small, it wasn't very liquid, and honestly, it was pretty inward-looking. They had these world-class ideas, but they were trapped because they didn't have the world-class capital to make them happen. This is where we meet our two main players, Novo and its biggest rival at home, Nordisk. And at this point in the story, they are in the exact same boat. I mean, both were super ambitious, both were making life-saving insulin, and both were staring at the exact same massive wall. A serious lack of access to major investment money. Okay, so this is where the whole story just takes a hard turn. Faced with this exact same problem, Novo chose a path that was, well, it was radical, it was risky, and in the end, it was completely revolutionary. They basically decided, hey, if the money's not in Copenhagen, we're going to go where the money is. And the guy driving the bus on this whole thing was their CEO, Mads Ovlesen. He had this amazing moment of clarity. I know it sounds kind of simple now, but back then it was this huge conceptual leap. He understood that staying local meant staying small, and Novo's dreams were anything but small. So you have to understand, this wasn't some spur-of-the-moment thing. It was a carefully executed plan, step by step. First, they tidied up their corporate structure in '73. Then, in '74, they took their first baby step and listed on their home exchange in Copenhagen. That taught them a lot about financial discipline. But the real game changer, the defining moment, was 1981, making that incredible leap across the Atlantic to the New York Stock Exchange. Now, you might be asking, how does a Danish company even do that? Well, they use this really clever financial instrument called an ADR, which stands for American Depository Receipt. The easiest way to think of it is like a passport for a stock. It basically takes Novo's Danish shares and repackages them into a format that any American investor could easily understand and buy right there on the New York Stock Exchange. And they didn't just stumble onto Wall Street, they came to play the game like total pros. They hired the best of the best, Goldman Sachs, to show them the ropes. They went on this big road show, flying all over the country to pitch their story to these skeptical American investors. And this is so critical. They completely overhauled their financial reporting to meet America's incredibly strict standards. That meant satisfying the SEC, the top financial cop on the beat, and adopting GAAP, the official accounting rulebook. And here's the thing you really have to get. This move wasn't just about cashing a big check. The act of listing on Wall Street, of putting themselves out there, it fundamentally changed the company from the inside out. I mean, this quote just says it all, doesn't it? The money was obviously a huge deal, but the real lasting impact was how it reshaped the very DNA of Novo. It literally forced them to evolve. So how did that makeover actually happen? Well, first, the intense scrutiny from US regulators forced them to become incredibly transparent about everything they did. Second, adopting those American accounting standards made them way more professional. And finally, the whole experience just lit a fire under them, giving them a more aggressive, more competitive mindset. They weren't just a Danish company anymore, they were a global player, and they started acting like one. So did the big gamble actually pay off in dollars and cents? Oh yeah, big time. The listing raised somewhere between $60 and $100 million in a few different stages. Now, for a company of their size back in the early 80s, that was an absolutely mind-boggling sum of money. And they didn't just let that cash sit in a bank account, no way. It became their war chest. They poured it into massive research and development projects, and, this is key, They started building out a US sales force to go head-to-head with the American giant Eli Lilly, right in its own backyard. Now, to really truly appreciate how brilliant Novo's move was, we have to look back at what their main competitor, Nordisk, was doing at the same time, because this is where the story becomes a tale of two companies that took two very, very different paths. I mean, the difference in strategy here is just night and day. Look at this. While Novo was tapping into the deepest pool of investors in the world in New York in 1981, Nordisk waited 3 whole years to list, and when they did it at home in Copenhagen. And the outcome? Novo suddenly had the fuel for massive global expansion, while Nordisk was still stuck, constrained by that much smaller local puddle of capital. And that's really the bottom line of this whole story. It all came down to that one single strategic decision. The choice to look beyond their own borders for money is what put Novo on the path to becoming the global giant we know today, while its rival was basically left in the dust trying to play catch-up. So imagine this. You're at the absolute top of your game, the leader in your industry. And then, almost overnight, a new technology comes along that threatens to make your entire business, everything you've built, completely obsolete. And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. It's such a classic business problem, right? Your main competitor has this shiny new piece of tech that's just better. So what do? Do you scramble to copy them and just play catch up forever? Or is there maybe another way to fight back and even win? To really get what was at stake here, we gotta rewind to the early 1980s. A brand new technology was about to completely flip the world of diabetes care on its head. And Novo found itself right in the crosshairs. See, for the longest time, the whole insulin game was about one thing: animal biology, specifically the pancreases from pigs and cows. And Novo? Well, Novo had perfected this. They had built this massive, incredibly efficient supply chain for these animal organs. They were the undisputed champs of the old way of doing things. But then, boom, the biotech bombshell dropped. A pioneering company called Genentech figured out how to use recombinant DNA to literally brew human insulin in a lab using E. coli bacteria. It was pure science fiction come to life. They licensed this amazing tech to Eli Lilly, Novo's biggest rival, who wasted no time launching it as a product called Humulin. Suddenly, this genetic threat wasn't a theory anymore, it was sitting on pharmacy shelves. And Eli Lilly's marketing? Oh, it was just brilliant. So simple, so powerful. And how could you even argue with it? Human insulin for humans. Why on earth would you use insulin from a pig when you could get something that was pure, identical to what your own body makes? It was a knockout punch aimed right at Novo's core business. And this kicked off what you could really call the molecule war. The whole game changed. It wasn't about who had the best supply chain for pig parts anymore. Nope. Now it was a race to see who could create the purest, most high-tech insulin molecule. So you had this fork in the road. Lilly went all in on the future, this purely lab-made biosynthetic route. Novo, on the other hand, made a critical mistake. They bet on a kind of halfway solution, a semi-synthetic method. They'd start with pork insulin and then chemically tweak it. It was clever, for sure, but it meant they were still chained to the old world, to the economics of pig glands. And you know what? That decision really hurt them. Lilly's human insulin for humans message, backed by their obviously superior tech, just started hammering Novo's market share, especially in the huge US market. They were losing the molecule war big time. But here's what's so important. Novo realized they messed up. They saw the writing on the wall and knew they had to pivot, and fast. So they started developing their own fully biosynthetic insulin, using yeast instead of bacteria, which was a pretty smart move. The problem was, they were now years behind their biggest competitor. They were stuck playing catch. Okay, so while Novo is scrambling in the lab, trying to catch up on the science, they stumbled onto a completely different battlefield. One that, frankly, their competitors had completely overlooked. They started looking beyond the molecule itself and started focusing on the actual person who had to use it every single day. And this right here is where the story gets really interesting. I mean, just read that quote. It's absolutely devastating. And it perfectly captures the reality for people with diabetes for decades. Taking their medicine wasn't just a medical chore, it was a source of deep shame and public stigma. The whole process was so awkward that people literally hid in bathroom stalls to inject, just to avoid being stared at. Let's just break down what that daily reality looked like. You had to carry around these little glass vials, long syringes. It was a whole kit. You would have to draw the liquid up, carefully measure the dose, flick out the air bubbles. It was this whole clumsy, multi-step ritual. It was difficult, it was awkward, and it felt anything but dignified. And Novo saw this. They recognized this deep, unspoken frustration. So while they were still fighting to catch up in the molecule war, they saw this other battle they could actually lead, the battle for the patient experience. And their weapon of choice? It was going to be a pen. So in 1985, because they were actually listening to patients, Novo launched something truly revolutionary. It was called the NovoPen. And it didn't look like scary medical equipment. It looked like a fancy fountain pen. It was sleek, it was simple, and it was about to change everything. I mean, the difference was just night and day. Forget the messy vials and syringes. With the NovoPen, you just clicked in a pre-filled cartridge of insulin, you turned a dial to the exact dose you needed, no guesswork, and then you could inject quickly and discreetly. It was a total revolution in simplicity. And this gets to the absolute core of why it worked so well. The NovoPen's biggest win wasn't just medical, it was psychological. It took a daily routine filled with shame, and it made it private, simple, and dignified. It gave control and a sense of normalcy back to the patient. It was life-changing. So this brings us to the big lesson of the whole story. To survive, Novo had to learn to fight on two fronts at the same time. Their strategy was so brilliant because it recognized that there are two very different kinds of innovation. You can really see their two-front war here. Look, on the battlefield of the molecule, they were on defense. They were playing catch-up, and yeah, they lost market share. But over on the battlefield of the patient, they went on the attack. The NovoPen created a brand new, highly profitable market, built not on a better molecule, but on a better experience. What Novo did here is something we now call patient-centric innovation. It's this simple but powerful idea that a breakthrough doesn't always have to be about the core tech. Sometimes the real innovation is in radically improving how a person experiences and lives with that technology. And with that one move, Novo completely changed the entire conversation. The competition wasn't just about whose insulin is the purest anymore. Suddenly, the winning question became, which system is the easiest to actually live with every single day? They didn't just play the game, they changed the rules. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from this whole incredible story. Novo didn't just survive, they thrived, because they understood that innovation has two equally important sides. Yes, of course, the science behind the molecule is critical, but understanding the human being who uses it, their frustrations, their needs, their desire for dignity, that is just as important.
For decades, a bitter corporate war was raging in Denmark, but it all ended with a secret pact, which created one of the most powerful pharmaceutical giants in the world. Today, we're going to unpack the incredible story of how Novo Nordisk was made.
It's a question straight out of a movie, right? But this wasn't Hollywood. For two Danish companies, it was a very real question of survival. This is the story of how a 64-year-long civil war turned into an unexpected and incredibly powerful alliance.
So picture this. For most of the 20th century, if you were in the Danish insulin business, you were on one of two teams. You were either Team Novo or Team Nordisk. And listen, these weren't just friendly competitors. This was a deep, bitter rivalry.
I mean, just let that sink in for a minute. This wasn't just about business strategy, it was personal. For generations, if you worked at one of these companies, you were literally trained to see the people at the other company as the enemy. That kind of feeling was just woven right into the fabric of who they were. And they couldn't have been more different. It was like they were philosophical opposites. You had Novo, the blue team. They were aggressive, commercial-focused, with a real engineering mindset. Then you had Nordisk, the green team, much more academic, led by a foundation, and proud of their scientific tradition. It's really hard to imagine two more different cultures trying to exist in the same small market.
Now look, all this intense competition, it definitely drove innovation. It forced both of them to be sharper, to be better. But by the late 1980s, that rivalry had become what you might call an unaffordable luxury. The world was changing, and their internal war was actually making them both vulnerable to bigger threats from the outside.
Okay, so take a look at these numbers. If you put them together, Novo and Nordisk actually controlled over half of the entire global insulin market. It's a huge deal. Novo had 34% and Nordisk had 20%. So what was the problem, right? They sound pretty dominant.
Well, here's the problem.
even with all that market power, they were just burning through money and resources fighting each other. They were duplicating their research, running competing ad campaigns, basically weakening themselves just as a much bigger threat was starting to appear on the horizon.
So the real threat, it wasn't in Denmark. It was the American titan, Eli Lilly, which was getting more and more aggressive. On top of that, the science was getting more expensive. The next generation of diabetes treatments was going to cost a fortune in R&D, the kind of money that neither company could really afford on its own, especially while fighting a war at home. The math just wasn't adding up anymore.
So, with their backs against the wall, the leaders of these two warring companies did the one thing that nobody expected. They started talking in secret.
And you know what? They moved incredibly fast. In 1988, the two CEOs, Mads Ovlesen from Novo and Henry Brenham from Nordisk, started these top-secret meetings. They knew if word got out, it could cause total chaos. And then, just a few months later, in January 1989, they announced the deal to a completely stunned industry. By the end of that year, Novo Nordisk was officially a reality.
Now, one of the most brilliant parts of this whole deal had to do with their foundations. They merged them to create the new Novo Nordisk Foundation, which would hold a controlling stake in the new company. It was like building a financial fortress, making sure the company would stay Danish, stay independent, and stay safe from any hostile takeovers. A really, really smart strategic move.
Okay, so announcing a merger is one thing. Actually making it work, that's something else entirely. Now came the really hard part. How on earth do you combine two fiercely proud, totally opposite cultures without bringing the new company to a grinding halt?
Well, management knew this wasn't going to be easy, so they were smart about it. They laid out this deliberate three-step plan. First up, just stabilize things. Get everyone on the same page, the same systems. Step 2, rationalize. Figure out which products and factories to keep. Streamline everything. And only then, after all that was done, did they tackle the biggest challenge of all, trying to merge the blue and green mindsets into one single Novo Nordisk way.
So after all that difficulty, all that pain, what was the result? Was it worth it? Oh yeah. The new company wasn't just bigger, it was way, way better. It suddenly had this set of advantages that no other competitor in the world could even touch.
I mean, the combined company was an absolute powerhouse. All of a sudden, they had the world's best production technology paired with Novo's revolutionary pen delivery system. They were also the leaders in using genetic engineering to make pure human insulin. And maybe most importantly, they finally had the financial muscle to take on anyone, anywhere in the world.
But here's the secret weapon, the real hidden gem in this whole story. Both companies, it turns out, had deep roots in something called fermentation technology, the same kind of process used to make enzymes. This shared history gave them this unique manufacturing expertise that their competitors, who didn't have that background, just couldn't copy. It was their ace in the hole.
In the 1990s, one of the biggest breakthroughs from a major pharmaceutical company had absolutely nothing to do with a new drug. No, this was something totally different. It was a new philosophy, a fundamental change in the company's soul that would end up redefining its entire future.
So think about this for a second. What if a company's most powerful innovation wasn't something you could put in a bottle? You know, in an industry that's completely obsessed with patents, Novo Nordisk made a really different kind of bet. They decided to stake their future not on what they made, but on who they were. And believe me, the payoff was bigger than anyone could have possibly imagined.
All right, so let's set the scene. We're going back to the 1990s. While pretty much all their competitors were scrambling to find the next blockbuster drug, Novo Nordisk made a move that was purely philosophical. It was a choice that would set them on a completely different path for decades to come.
At the time, the whole pharma industry was just getting hammered by controversy. You had pricing scandals, ethical questions flying around. It was a mess. And seeing all this, Novo Nordisk decided, you know what? We're going to walk away from that chaos and forge a different path, one that was actually built on transparency and accountability.
But here's the thing. This wasn't just some nice feel-good decision they made in a comfortable boardroom. No way. The company was facing some serious heat from the outside world, and it was forcing them to rethink, well, everything. The real question was, could they actually handle the pressure?
So in the early 90s, they were really under the microscope. They were getting tough questions about their environmental impact. There was this growing public anxiety about GMOs being used in their insulin. And on top of all that, they were trying to break into a very skeptical US market. They quickly realized that just staying quiet and hoping it would all go away wasn't an option anymore. In fact, silence had become a huge strategic liability.
The real turning point, though, came in 1992. The company sent a team to the Rio Earth Summit, and as one of their executives later said, it was a total eye-opener. They realized they couldn't just keep reacting to problems. If they wanted to keep their license to operate, they had to get way out ahead of these issues and be totally transparent about their impact on the world.
So what did they do? And this is where it gets really interesting. This wasn't about launching a new PR campaign or some slick marketing. They adopted a radical new corporate philosophy that would become the very core of who they were.
They committed to something called the triple bottom line. The idea is actually pretty simple, but it's incredibly powerful. It says that a company's success shouldn't just be measured by profit. Instead, it has to be a careful balance of 3 key pillars, all treated as equally important: financial growth, social responsibility, and environmental soundness. And I want to be super clear here, this commitment went deep. For most companies back then, social responsibility was just a nice-sounding marketing slogan. For Novo Nordisk, the triple bottom line became a legal obligation. I mean, they literally wrote it into their company bylaws. It wasn't just a part of their business strategy, it was their business strategy.
Okay, so a philosophy is one thing, but talk is cheap, right? How did Novo Nordisk actually turn these high-minded principles into real-world practice?
Oh, they moved fast. By 1994, they put out one of the world's first ever corporate environmental reports, which back then was a radical act of transparency. Then they put their money where their mouth was, signing a huge 20-year contract that helped fund a massive offshore wind farm. And by 1999, they were publishing these integrated reports, putting their environmental and social numbers right next to their financial results for every single investor to see. They also launched this thing called a Blueprint for Change, which was all about proving that their business success was tied directly to how well their patients were doing. Their motto was simple: what is good for patients is good for us. This might sound familiar because it was basically an early version of what the entire healthcare industry now calls value-based care. They were decades ahead of the curve.
So the big question, did all this values talk actually work as a business strategy? Did it translate to the bottom line? The answer is, oh yeah, big time.
To really get the impact, just look at this number, 25%. In the year 2000, that was Novo Nordisk's share of the US market. You know, they were a player, for sure, but they weren't the leader. Their triple bottom line strategy was about to change all of that. See, this values-driven approach had very real, tangible business benefits. It helped them build crucial trust with doctors and patients in that skeptical US market. It turned them into a magnet for top talent, people who wanted to work for a company that actually had a purpose. This transparency also got them listed on sustainability indexes, which in turn attracted stable, long-term investors. Exactly the kind of patient capital a research-heavy company needs to thrive.
But here's the real kicker. The payoff was even more direct. The stability and trust they earned didn't just boost their reputation. It gave them the financial firepower they needed for their next massive breakthrough.
And that breakthrough was a drug called NovoPen. It got approved in 1999, and it was a game-changing treatment for rare bleeding disorders. This was a huge win that proved they could innovate way beyond their core diabetes business, and it created a powerful new stream of revenue.
And here's the most important part of the whole story. The success of NovoPen wasn't some separate lucky break. It happened because of their ethical strategy. That long-term capital they attracted from their TBL commitment gave them the financial stability to fund the massive R&D it took to create this blockbuster drug. In other words, their philosophy directly funded their science.
This is the story of a company that found itself in a moral crucible, a test that would really challenge the very core of what it stood for. And really, that's what this whole thing comes down to, right? This one powerful question. When profit and public health are on a collision course, what's a company's ultimate responsibility? That's the heart of the conflict we're about to unpack.
All right, so our story starts at the turn of the century in South Africa, a nation that was in the grip of a just devastating public health crisis. And let's be clear, the scale of this was absolutely immense. The HIV/AIDS pandemic was at its peak, and it was creating this unimaginable human tragedy that would become the backdrop for every single decision that followed.
And you can see just how fast this all went down. In the late 90s, the crisis hits this horrific peak. By 97, the government fights back with a really controversial new law. And then, just 4 years later, boom, a full-blown legal war erupts, with 39 of the world's biggest drug companies.
So, what did this law actually do that caused such an uproar? Well, it gave the South African government some serious new powers.
It let them shop around the globe for cheaper versions of patented drugs, push for generics, and even consider breaking patents to make their own life-saving medicines. You know, from their point of view, it was a desperate measure for a very desperate time.
And that right there, that set the stage for an absolute showdown. This wasn't just some legal fight. It was a collision between two powerful, deeply held principles: patents versus patients.
And here you can see the two sides laid out pretty clearly. On one side, you have South Africa saying, look, we have a moral duty to save our people, and that trumps everything else. But on the other side, the pharmaceutical industry is arguing that protecting their patents is absolutely essential for innovation. And by the way, it's a right that's protected by international law, like the WTO's TRIPS agreement, which basically sets the rules for intellectual property.
So the industry's case really rested on these four big ideas. They claimed the act was basically an illegal seizure of their intellectual property. They argued the high prices weren't about profits, but about covering the massive costs of research and development. But maybe most importantly, they were terrified that if South Africa won, it would create a domino effect, unraveling patent protections all over the world.
And here's where it gets really fascinating. For a company like Novo Nordisk, this wasn't even about HIV/AIDS drugs. They're a diabetes company. They joined the lawsuit purely to protect the precedent. They were worried that if South Africa could get away with bypassing patents for AIDS medication, well, what's to stop another country from doing the exact same thing for their insulin patent?
So these companies thought they were just defending a core business principle. But what they totally failed to see was how the rest of the world was going to react. And this is where the story takes a huge dramatic turn.
And yeah, dramatic turn might be an understatement. What started as a legal strategy to protect their business quickly spiraled into a public relations catastrophe on a global scale. It was a massive, catastrophic miscalculation.
The backlash was just immediate and incredibly powerful. The optics were just awful. You had activist groups that masterfully framed the whole debate as a simple, brutal choice: profits or lives. And the image of these wealthy corporations suing the government of a revered global icon like Nelson Mandela, while millions of his people were dying, public opinion just wouldn't stand for it.
Just look at that number, 39. 39 of the world's biggest pharmaceutical giants. We're talking names like GlaxoSmithKline, Merck, all lined up against one developing nation. That number alone tells you everything you need to know about the David versus Goliath story that immediately took hold.
So, with the entire world watching and the pressure just mounting from all sides, this corporate coalition found itself in a position that was, well, it was impossible. Something had to give.
And give it did. The coalition first started to crack, and then it just completely fell apart. In what people at the time called an unconditional surrender, all 39 companies completely withdrew their lawsuit. Just like that, the fight was over.
Okay, so when the dust settled, what did the final deal look like? Well, the pharma companies didn't just drop the case. They actually agreed to pay South Africa's legal fees. In return, South Africa publicly said, okay, we're still committed to international trade rules, but, and this is the key part, it got to keep the very powers the lawsuit was trying to stop. It was a clear, undeniable victory for the South African government. And wow, this quote from Novo Nordisk CEO Lars Sørensen really says it all, doesn't it? It's such a blunt admission of a massive strategic blunder. He basically admitted the company had been caught completely flat-footed, totally failing to see the bigger picture, the societal context of what they were doing. This was that moment of truth.
But you know, the story doesn't just end there with a failed lawsuit. For Novo Nordisk, this absolute crisis became the catalyst for a profound, permanent change in how it saw its place in the world.
What they learned was this incredibly important idea of social legitimacy. The leadership realized that just following the law, it's not enough. Especially for a healthcare company, you need a social license to operate. You need the genuine trust and acceptance of society itself. Without that, you've got nothing.
And this wasn't just some PR campaign, you know? They actually took concrete steps. They created the World Diabetes Foundation, and they funded it with a slice of their own profits. They also brought in a tiered pricing system, making sure that essential insulin would be available at or near cost in the world's poorest countries.
And the end result of all this? The pivot completely transformed the company's public identity. They went from being on the wrong side of a massive human rights debate to becoming a recognized global leader in corporate social responsibility. I mean, what a remarkable turnaround.
So what if I told you the best way for a company to grow was to break itself in half? And that really is the big question here. I mean, why would a super successful company just decide to split itself apart?
Well, the answer comes down to a classic business problem. What happens when you have two very different and very unhappy families living under the same roof? You see, by the turn of the millennium, Novo Nordisk was really facing an identity crisis. On paper, it was one company, but in reality, it was running two completely different businesses. And, the cracks are really starting to show. Okay, so let's break down the conflict. On one side, you've got the healthcare division. This is a world of long, expensive R&D, huge investments in things like insulin. On the other side, you've got industrial enzymes. This is a fast-paced, business-to-business market. Think detergents, food, textiles, where you need to be super agile to compete. These two businesses weren't just a little different, they were speaking completely different languages. And this mismatch created a huge problem, something Wall Street calls the conglomerate discount. Here's the deal. When you bundle two totally different businesses together, investors kind of get confused. They can't figure out how to value either one properly. So the market was completely overlooking the massive potential of the pharma side because it was tied to the enzymes business. The whole company was actually worth less than the sum of its parts. So the problem's clear. The pressure is on to unlock all that hidden value. What do? Well, Novo Nordisk made a really bold decision. They weren't just going to rearrange things. They were going to perform what amounted to strategic surgery. And here it is, the big moment. In November of 2000, they did it. They executed a demerger, which is basically a corporate divorce, and they spun off the entire industrial enzyme business, letting it go off and chart its own course. And that new, independent company was given a new name, NovoZymes. Now, this wasn't just a simple rebranding. No. This was the birth of a brand new, publicly traded company with its own mission, its own goals, its own future. The effect of the split on the original company? It was immediate and absolutely staggering. The newly focused Novo Nordisk, now a pure healthcare company, had a market capitalization of about 10.3 billion euros. And NovoZymes? It started its new life with a very respectable but much smaller market cap of 1.2 billion euros. The stage was now set for two totally separate growth stories to unfold. Now, you might be asking, how did they manage this without losing control? Well, this is the really brilliant part. A holding company, Novo Holdings, actually kept a controlling stake in both of the new companies. They did this using special shares with super voting rights. Think of it like a fortress strategy. It protected both Novo Nordisk and NovoZymes from hostile takeovers and let them focus on the long term instead of just next quarter's earnings. So the split is complete. Both companies are now safe inside their own fortress. They were finally free to go after their own destinies. But what did that freedom actually look like? What did they do with it? For Novo Nordisk, it was like a shot of pure adrenaline. They could finally pour every single dollar of free cash back into their one true mission, fighting diabetes and other diseases. This laser focus just supercharged their R&D, and it's what laid the groundwork for the world-changing drugs that would eventually make them one of the most valuable companies on the entire planet. They weren't a company with two minds anymore, they were a titan in the making. And what about NovoZymes? Oh, it didn't just survive, it absolutely thrived. Cut loose from the slower pharma world, it became a master of its own universe. It went after strategic partnerships, like its groundbreaking work in bioethanol. It was nimble, it was fast, it was a force to be reckoned with. And this all led to a massive merger in 2024, creating a new powerhouse called Novo Nordisk, a journey that would have been completely impossible under the old structure. So let's step back for a second. More than 2 decades later, what is the ultimate legacy of this whole thing? Well, it's a really powerful lesson in corporate strategy, that's for sure. The big takeaway is this. The demerger wasn't about admitting failure. It was about embracing focus. By recognizing that its two halves just weren't compatible, Novo Nordisk unlocked an immense amount of value and allowed two world-class businesses to grow and excel on their own terms.
Let's talk about a company that's become so massive, it's actually more valuable than the entire economy of its home country. Yeah, you heard that right. We're going to pull back the curtain on the decades-long strategy that turned Novo Nordisk into an absolute juggernaut.
You know, it's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? How does a company get that big? Is it just one brilliant invention? A crazy stroke of luck? Or is it something more deliberate, something built, piece by piece, over decades? Well, for Novo Nordisk, the answer is crystal clear. See, for them, it's not about one magic pill. It's about a masterclass in building moats. And I don't mean just one moat, we're talking multiple overlapping layers of competitive advantage that make their castle almost impossible to attack. We're gonna break down every single one.
So where do we start? Well, believe it or not, our story begins not with a drug, but with a device. It sounds simple, but this one move would completely reshape the market and build their very first and maybe most tangible moat.
Okay, here's the core insight that changed everything back in the 90s. The molecule, the insulin, that's the cure, right? But the device, that's the patient's daily experience. It's what they touch, what they use, what they rely on every single day. The strategists realized if you control that experience, you control the market.
And this timeline just shows how obsessed they were with the patient. It wasn't one giant leap. It was this relentless series of small, smart innovations. The NovoPen 3 saved people money by not wasting insulin. The DemiPen was brilliant. It targeted a specific need for kids. But the FlexPen? Oh, that was the real game changer. Making it pre-filled and disposable just removed a huge headache for patients. It instantly made their product the easiest one to use, period.
So here's the crucial part. That convenience became a powerful form of lock-in. Think about it. If you're a patient using this super simple pre-filled FlexPen, are you really going to switch to a competitor's insulin? No way. You'd have to learn a whole new, probably more complicated device. This patient-first design built an incredibly strong moat around their core products.
But a great pen is only half the story. Once they had patients locked into their device ecosystem, Novo Nordisk turned its full attention to winning the scientific arms race that was happening inside the vial itself.
The 2000s were all about this huge leap from standard human insulin to something called insulin analogs. Just think of analogs as designer insulin. These were molecules that scientists literally engineered to work faster or last longer, to act much more like the insulin your own body would naturally produce.
And what's so smart here is the two-front war they waged. With Novolog, they went head-to-head with Eli Lilly for control of mealtime insulin. Then, with Levemir, they took on Sanofi's massive blockbuster, Lantus. By fighting on both fronts at the same time, and even finding a clever marketing angle for Levemir with less weight gain, they built this powerhouse portfolio that drove incredible growth and cemented their dominance.
But, even for a juggernaut, the road isn't always smooth. In fact, the next chapter in their strategy wasn't defined by a slick product launch, but by a high-stakes, knockdown, drag-out fight with regulators that could have wrecked everything. So by the early 2010s, they had their next crown jewel ready to go, a drug called Tresiba. This was an ultra-long-acting insulin, the clear next step up from Levemir. Everybody, and I mean everybody, expected it to just sail right through the approval process. And then, nope. It was like they were speeding down the highway and just hit a solid brick wall. A huge, stunning setback from the one agency they absolutely had to win over.
The FDA rejected the drug, flat out, citing some wider concerns about diabetes drugs at the time. They demanded a massive new trial just to prove Tresiba was safe for the heart. This was a devastating blow. It meant years of delay in the US and basically handed their biggest competitor a continued monopoly.
But this is where that resilience builds the third moat. Instead of just giving up, they took the gamble. They poured a ton of money into this enormous trial they called Devote. And wow, did it pay off. The data not only proved the drug was safe, but it actually showed Tresiba was better than the competition, causing way less severe low blood sugar. They literally turned a regulatory nightmare into a powerful marketing weapon, finally getting that approval in 2015.
Okay, so their insulin business is a fortress. They've perfected the device, they've perfected the molecule for injections, but what's the next frontier? Well, the ultimate convenience for a patient, the absolute holy grail of drug delivery, is a pill. And after a century of trying, they realized the answer wasn't to invent it themselves, it was to go out and buy it. The key was this incredible technology called SNAC. For 100 years, big molecule drugs like insulin or semaglutide had to be injected because your stomach acid just destroys them. Well, this SNAC molecule acts like a tiny bodyguard. It neutralizes the acid in a small patch and helps the drug slip right through the stomach wall into your bloodstream. It was a total game changer.
And to secure this future, Novo Nordisk didn't just license the tech. Oh no. In November 2020, they bought the entire company that made it, Emisphere, for $1.8 billion. This move gave them complete control to develop pills for all their future drugs, with no strings attached.
And they didn't stop there. Not even close. Just 1 year later, they spent nearly double that. a whopping $3.3 billion to buy another company, Dicerna Pharmaceuticals, and this was a clear signal of where they were headed next.
The Dicerna deal brought in a totally different kind of tech called RNA interference, or RNAi. Basically, this platform lets them turn off or silence specific genes in the liver that cause diseases. This was a move all about diversification, expanding their toolkit way beyond peptides and into a whole new universe of therapies.
So when you put all these pieces together, when you step back and look at the whole picture, what do you see? You see a clear, repeatable formula. It's a blueprint for how to build a juggernaut.
The formula is pretty straightforward when you lay it out. First, you become obsessed with the patient experience. Second, you win the scientific arms race with the best molecules. Third, you have the guts to turn a crisis into an advantage. And finally, when you can't build the future yourself, you go out and buy it.
Today, we're diving into a class of drugs that did more than just create a new market. We're talking about something that completely rewrote the rules for modern medicine, for global business, and, get this, even for the economy of an entire country. So, let's get into it.
To really wrap your head around the sheer scale of this story, you just have to look at these two numbers. By 2023, the market value of a single company, Novo Nordisk, had blown past the entire economic output, the GDP, of its home country, Denmark. Think about that for a second. A single company became bigger than the nation it calls home.
So that's the big question, right? How on earth does that happen? Well, this whole journey didn't start in some corporate boardroom. It started in a lab with scientists trying to solve a really specific, really tricky biological problem.
Yeah, before any of this revolution could happen, scientists had a fundamental challenge to overcome, one that was actually presented by our own bodies.
It all centers on this guy right here, a hormone called GLP-1. Now, in your body, it's fantastic. It helps manage your blood sugar right after you eat. It's a really important part of our natural metabolic system. A powerful tool, for sure.
But, and this is a huge but, here's the problem. Our bodies are almost too efficient. There's this enzyme that swoops in and basically destroys natural GLP-1 in just a couple of minutes. And that makes it totally useless as a drug, right? It's gone before it can do any real lasting good.
And this is where the genius solution comes in. Scientists at Novo Nordisk engineered a modified version of GLP-1. What they did was they attached a fatty acid sidechain to it, which kind of acts like a protective shield. It lets the molecule hitch a ride on a protein in our blood, which protects it from being destroyed so quickly. And just like that, they turned a hormone that lasted minutes into a drug that could last for a whole day.
So that incredible innovation led directly to the company's first huge breakthrough drug, and this really set the stage for everything that was about to follow.
That first drug was called liraglutide, but you probably know it as Victoza. It was approved back in 2010 for type 2 diabetes, and it was a total game changer. It was great at controlling blood sugar, it didn't have the same scary risks as insulin, and here's the kicker, patients started losing weight on it. It took over the market.
Now this is where the strategy gets really interesting. Seeing that weight loss effect, Novo Nordisk thought, what if we test a higher dose of this stuff, but specifically for weight management? That became the drug Saxenda, and its approval was pivotal. It proved that regulators were ready to see obesity not just as a lifestyle choice, but as a treatable, chronic disease. That opened a door for what was coming next.
Okay, so Victoza and Saxenda were huge hits, no doubt about it. But the next molecule they developed, it wasn't just an improvement, it was a complete and total quantum leap.
And that next molecule was semaglutide. Scientists tweaked the first-generation drug to make it even stronger and last even longer. The result? They went from a once-a-day shot to a much more convenient once-a-week injection. You know these names, Ozempic for diabetes and Wegovy for weight loss.
And the results? I mean, they were just jaw-dropping. Look at this chart. It's not even a contest. While the first drug gave you about 5 to 10% weight loss, patients on Wegovy were losing 15% or even more of their total body weight. The difference was just dramatic.
To really put that into perspective, this quote just nails it. The amount of weight people were losing was something you'd only ever seen before with major invasive bariatric surgery. And now, you could get results in that ballpark from a simple weekly injection. So when the FDA approved Wegovy in June 2021, it wasn't just another day at the office. This was a seismic shift in global healthcare.
It was the moment the world started to see obesity not as a lifestyle issue, but as a legitimate medical condition with a seriously effective treatment.
But here's the thing about that kind of wild, unprecedented success. It comes with consequences that nobody, not even the company that created the miracle drug, was fully prepared to handle. The economic shockwave in Denmark was just huge. We already saw how the company's value dwarfed the country's GDP. But dig a little deeper. In 2023, the pharmaceutical industry, basically powered by Novo Nordisk, was responsible for 2/3 of Denmark's entire economic growth. Take them out of the equation, and the economy would have been completely flat.
This actually created a textbook economic scenario called Dutch disease. You had this massive river of foreign cash flooding into Denmark to buy these drugs, which pushed the value of their currency, the krone, way up. To stop it from getting too strong, Denmark's central bank had to keep interest rates lower than the rest of Europe, which starts to mess with the rest of the economy.
And at the very same time, demand just completely overwhelmed the supply chain. For years, there were global shortages of both Wegovy and Ozempic. So what was the solution? An absolute power move. In February 2024, Novo's parent company dropped over $16 billion to buy one of its key manufacturing partners, basically bringing production in-house to finally get a handle on it all.
So, when you step back and look at the whole story, it's just incredible. A single scientific breakthrough, originally designed to help people with diabetes, accidentally sparked a cultural phenomenon. It ended up redefining how we treat obesity, transforming a global industry, and literally changing the economic reality of an entire country.
Today, let's get into the incredible fight facing the pharmaceutical giant Novo Nordisk. I mean, this is a company that built a multi-billion-dollar empire, and for years, they wore the crown pretty comfortably. But, a series of seismic shocks has put everything on the line, and now that crown is very much up for grabs.
So this was the feeling back on May 16th, 2025. And honestly, it wasn't an exaggeration. You have a company at the absolute peak of its power just suddenly thrown into a massive crisis. The big question is, what could possibly shake a giant of this magnitude?
Well, the story really begins right where these corporate dramas so often do, at the very top. A sudden, totally unexpected change in leadership sent these massive shockwaves, not just through the company, but really through the entire industry. And this timeline just shows you the sheer speed of this fall. I mean, in mid-2024, Novo Nordisk was literally on top of the world, riding its greatest expansion ever. But then, less than a year later, the CEO who oversaw that historic rise was gone. It was just a stunningly quick reversal of fortune. Now, the official reason they gave pointed to market challenges. But come on, this was the leader who had turned the company into a global behemoth. So you have to ask, what specific challenge was so huge that it required such a drastic move? Well, the answer really lies in the science. Because see, this crisis wasn't just about what the market was thinking, it was rooted in hard scientific data. A direct challenge from their fiercest rival was about to completely change the game and call Novo Nordisk's dominance into question. And here it is, the catalyst. In late 2024, Eli Lilly, Novo Nordisk's biggest rival, released the results of a direct, head-to-head clinical trial. This wasn't just speculation. This was a direct comparison of their flagship weight loss drugs. And you can bet the market held its breath. And the results? They were decisive. Novo Nordisk's Wegovy delivered a really impressive 13.7% average weight loss, but Eli Lilly's Zepbound, it delivered a staggering 20.2%. In this industry, that isn't just a win, that's a knockout. So why the huge difference? Well, it all came down to the science underneath. Wegovy targets a single hormone receptor that's involved in appetite. It's called GLP-1. But Zepbound targets two, GLP-1 and another one called GIP. This dual-action approach was immediately seen as a more advanced technology, and it created this powerful story that maybe Novo Nordisk had lost its innovative edge. But this clinical challenge didn't happen in a vacuum. Right as Novo Nordisk was grappling with this tech setback, it found itself fighting a brutal war on two other critical fronts: pricing and patents. It was a perfect storm, really, where a loss in any one of these areas could have been catastrophic. Okay, so the first major pressure point came from Washington, D.C. The Inflation Reduction Act gave the U.S. government the power to negotiate drug prices for the first time ever, and guess what? Novo Nordisk's blockbuster drugs were right at the top of their list. And to really get the impact, just look at this number. Before any negotiations, the list price for a monthly supply of Ozempic one of their absolute key products, was nearly $1,000. And then, this is the result of those negotiations. The new price, which will take effect in 2027, is just $274. That is a massive cut that fundamentally changes the company's revenue projections. It forces them to rely on huge volume just to offset that lower price for every patient.
But while they were taking a hit on pricing, Novo Nordisk was playing defense brilliantly on another front. In late 2024, they successfully settled a bunch of patent lawsuits with several generic drug makers. This move basically secured their fortress, delaying generic competition and protecting their key revenue streams for several more critical years.
So, with the leadership shaken and the company fighting on multiple fronts, the question became, how do they fight back? And this brings us to the comeback plan, an aggressive race to regain their clinical and technological crown. The first move was so decisive, and it really shows you Novo Nordisk's hidden superpower. The controlling Novo Nordisk Foundation isn't your typical shareholder just chasing quarterly profits. It has this long-term humanitarian mission, which gives it the power to make these bold moves for the company's future. And they use that power to bring back a legendary former CEO, Lars Rebien Sørensen, with a really clear mandate: speed up the next generation of drugs, no matter the short-term cost. And that future has a name: Cadre-Semema. This is Novo Nordisk's big answer to Eli Lilly's Zepbound. It's a next-generation combination drug that's designed not just to compete, but to win. Now, what's really interesting here is the data. Early results show CagriSema delivering an average weight loss of 22.7%. I mean, look at that. It doesn't just match Zepbound's 20.2%, it actually surpasses it. This is the data point that could neutralize Eli Lilly's advantage and put Novo Nordisk right back on top. So all of this, the leadership changes, the clinical trials, the pricing pressures, it all sets the stage for what the industry is now calling the Great Duopoly War. This is a head-to-head battle between two titans, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, for control of one of the largest drug markets in history.
So what's the path forward look like? It really comes down to a three-step mission. First, they have to execute perfectly on the launch of Kikasmet and their other new drugs. Second, they've got to massively scale up manufacturing to meet what's going to be incredible demand. And third, they have to win the daily market battle for doctors and patients against a really formidable rival.
And you know, this leaves us with the central question. The events of the last few years have been a powerful reminder that in the high-stakes world of pharmaceuticals, past success means nothing. Innovation is the only currency that truly matters. Novo Nordisk has a powerful new pipeline. The question is, will it be enough to reclaim the crown?